Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I am your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you're watching on YouTube, especially, but even on any of our other platforms, watching for the first time and have not subscribed to our channel or the platforms that you're on, hit the button to follow, subscribe, whatever the case might be, to be notified when new content comes out. You can keep up to date on what is going on with us on the show. All right. So we are back in the saddle. Apologies for being a bit late. Had to take care of some domestic duties in relation to what we're talking about today. So I want to look at kind of a very specific part of I have the First London Baptist Confession of Faith, the 1646 edition, here published by Particular Baptist Heritage Press. And I want to talk about a particular section of it. It's actually in the appendix of this book. It's not in the main body of the text, but it is part of the appendix, but nonetheless still a very important aspect of the confession. It is in what's labeled in this edition as Appendix A. And this appendix was published in 1646 with the 1646 edition, and it seems to add more topics to the confession. I don't know if it came later in the year or before. I don't know, but it was added. It's an appendix to the confession nonetheless. But it seems to cover miscellaneous topics. You'll notice it will go from like talking about particular redemption to the Christian's duty in holiness to what we're talking about today, domestic duties. It seems to cover some miscellaneous aspects that the Particular Baptists who put this together thought were important. And from the title of the appendix, it was written to bring more clarity to the Particular Baptist beliefs, and it was written by Benjamin Coxe. And this is significant because Benjamin Coxe was the father of Nehemiah Coxe, who was involved. We've mentioned him multiple times on the show before. He was one of the key men behind the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. He was the front runner in dealing with Thomas Collier, where that confession, that controversy likely spawned the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. So you have this generational wealth of knowledge that you see here. Benjamin Coxe coming from the Church of England, he being a minister in the Church of England and took on Baptist convictions and became involved in particular Baptist circles and really helped to establish the Particular Baptists. So we see him authoring this appendix and putting forth these clarifications. And Benjamin even calls himself in the title of this appendix a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I think he was a pastor or some kind of teacher in Christ's church. It says also the reason for its publishing in the title. It says, published for the further clearing of truth and discovery of their mistake, who have imagined dissent in fundamentals when there is none. So it was really meant to silence those who were saying the Particular Baptists were teaching things contrary to sound doctrine. That's really what the focus was for this particular appendix. As if the content of the confession itself wasn't enough to do that, but apparently this was needed. It seems, and maybe if I can just pull it up here, excuse me, pull up the title here, and let's take a look. It says, a more full declaration of the faith and judgment of baptized believers, occasioned by the inquiry of some woe-affected, and godly persons in the country, written by Benjamin Coxe, a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ, published for the further clearing of truth and discovery of their mistake, who have imagined a dissent in fundamentals when there is none. And Matthew 10:27 through 28 is quoted here as well. So it was meant to clear up any misconceptions that certain people had. Remember, the particular Baptists were fighting, really, the publishing of this entire confession was meant to clear the particular Baptist name against the accusation that they were they were Anabaptists. It was to vindicate them. And that's even part of the title of this of the confession, right? That's part of the title. Trying to find it here. Yeah, a confession of faith, second churches, which are commonly but unjustly called Anabaptists, published for the vindication of the truth and information of the ignorant, likewise for the taking off of those aspersions which are frequently both in pulpit and print unjustly cast upon us. So it was meant to be a clarification. Like, we're not those Anabaptists over there. We're not the Anabaptists. We're not like them. You guys lump us together with them, right? And it seems that there was, it says in print and in preaching. So they were being preached against from the pulpit, and there was publishing against them. And they came together and they thought that they needed to be vindicated, right? We are not those guys. Here's our theology. This is what we believe. We're with you on the fundamentals. Of course, there's differences. There's baptism is a big one. Church polity is another. But, on the fundamentals of the faith, we're with you guys, the Reformed. We're with the Orthodox. Because the Anabaptists had gone off and done quite a bit of their own things. And I was reading, actually, Matthew Barrett's book, The Reformation as Renewal. I have a copy of that. And he has some interesting things on the Anabaptists, at least early on, the 16th century Anabaptists. And I was looking at it in relation to Zwingli and Zurich and how they dealt with the Anabaptists there and how they were perceived. I mean, they were considered troublemakers. They were dissenters. They were disturbers of the peace. And they taught theology that the broader, I guess, Orthodox, at the time it would have been a little bit different, but the broader Orthodox believers thought were incorrect, right? Especially after the Munster incident in the 16th century, where Anabaptists caused civil unrest at a level that really was unacceptable and left a stench in the nostrils of the Reformed. So these guys come along and they sound like them. It's like, wait, no, we're not like them. Here's what we believe, right? So it seems this appendix was further clarifying that and helping to bring closure to those misunderstandings, right? So addressing these particular issues, I think, was to bring out that we're not Anabaptists, to further clarify that even more. Now, what I want to look at today is section 21 of this appendix, section 21 of the appendix, which lays out the duty of Christians toward different types of relations, and that Christians are not to be disconnected from society, but rather steeped into it according to God's precepts. So we'll read a little bit here. Actually, I might just read it's not long. It's section 21 of the appendix. It's called Domestic Duties. As Christ doth not teach nor allow that we should be without natural affection or unsociable, see Romans 1:31, so our being made partakers of Christ doth not discharge us from the duties of our relations. Believing servants must perform the duties of servants toward their masters, though unbelieving, 1 Timothy 6:1. So believing children must perform the duties of children toward their parents, Colossians 3:20. Believing wives, the duties of wives toward their husbands, 1 Peter 3:1. And believing subjects must be subject to principalities and powers and obey magistrates, Romans 13:1, Titus 3:1, 1 Peter 2:13-15. But still, they must remember that their fear toward God must not be taught by the precept of men, Isaiah 29:13, and they ought to obey God rather than men, Acts 5:29, and that the submission that must be given to men must be given to them for the Lord's sake, 1 Peter 2:14. Thus I conclude with the apostles' words in 2 Timothy 2:7, a little varied, but not misapplied. Consider what we teach, and the Lord give you understanding in all things. So there was no concept among the particular Baptists who were part of this confession, that indicates they believed in physical separation from the world. They didn't. In fact, they taught completely opposite. And this, I think, would have been against what you see among Anabaptists, at least later on, like with the Amish and even the Mennonites to some extent, although at least modern day Mennonites are very much involved in worldly affairs, but separate in different ways. But you do see this kind of idea of a withdrawal, right? Especially among the Amish. But particular Baptists kind of tried to disconnect themselves from society in ways that were not healthy, right? Especially in relation to the government. That was a huge problem. And it's one that the particular Baptists had to fight against. And we just put out an article yesterday on particular Baptists and religious liberty. And in that article, there is discussion surrounding Quakerism and things like that. So this is kind of pushing against things like that, things that would come from like the Anabaptists and the Quakers, who did not believe in a proper view of government and had this kind of almost like a separationism from the world. But particular Baptists saying, no, we are not like those Anabaptists. Remember, the purpose of this confession is to vindicate themselves that they are Anabaptists. So the only way to properly read this in context is that they're saying, no, we're not like those guys. We're not Anabaptists, right? We're normal. We're trying to live in a way that is pleasing to God, but that doesn't mean that we come out of the world. And it's interesting that they caveat it with this: as Christ doth not teach nor allow that we should be without natural affection or unsociable, so our being made partakers of Christ doth not discharge us from the duties of our relations. Just because you're a Christian does not mean that you get to just separate yourself from the world and not fulfill your duties towards those relations that God has said we are to do. And so the particular Baptists were very clear that this was something that they had obligation to do and needed to do. They were to be involved in everyday life, taking care of their families, taking care of their children to parents, wives to husbands, etc., right? Citizen to government. Those relations were to be taken care of. They weren't to be thrown aside just because, oh, I'm a Christian now, so I don't have to do any of these things anymore. I just withdraw myself from the world, right? But what they're laying out here is really the practical nature of the Christian life, meaning the gospel does not take away our life in the world, but rather establishes it in its correct ends. The gospel does not take away our life in the world, but rather establishes it to its correct ends. That is what the gospel does. And the particular Baptists were careful to point out their obligations. Okay? They were careful to point out their obligations. What is it that they had to do? They weren't to be weird and pulling themselves out of the world and live like these stoic, holier than thou people. They were to take care of the relations that they had obligation to. They were to be involved in the world. They were not to withdraw themselves just because they were Christians. Now, if you, and it's interesting too that Romans 1:31 is given here as a proof text, that they're not to be without natural affection or unsociable. And I want to pull this up here because I think that this brings out certain, it's not a text you would think that would be used for, I'm pulling it up here. It's not something you would think that would be used to prove something like this. But Romans 1:31 says, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful. And this is from Paul's exhortation surrounding pagans, right? The wrath of God in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed against all unrighteousness, ungodliness of men who in their unrighteousness suppress the truth, right? And then he talks about different sins and the ways that suppression is done and how evil men live apart from God. And one of those things is they're untrustworthy, they're unloving, they're unforgiving, and they're unmerciful, they're undiscerning. They're just turds. They're mean, right? They're not sociable or friendly people, right? So what they're saying here is that we're not to be living in an unsociable way, living in a way that is we're mean to people, we're pushing people away, we're being we're not obligating ourselves towards our relations. We're not living in a way that is pleasing to God towards those around us. We're not to do that. We're not to be unsociable, right? Not to be unsociable or without natural affection. We're to be kind to our neighbors. We're to love our neighbors. We're to be forgiving. We're to be long suffering, etc. Right? Not to be unsociable. It's not a verse that you would think would be a proof text, but when I read it, it kind of was like, oh wow, that's interesting. I never really considered that in terms of applying it in this kind of situation before, but they saw this as crucial to that verse is crucial to this argument. So they were not to be antisocial individuals. They're to be submitting to government, taking care of their families. And this paragraph really puts any concerns about the particular Baptist view of the Christian's relation to society, to the world, to bed. So how are we to think of these things biblically? All right, we've looked at this somewhat historically, particular Baptists talking about these things. But how are we to think about how we relate to the world as Christians? How are we as Christians to relate to this world? Well, I think there's two places we can find this, and there's more probably, but these are two that I think just came top of mind. John 17:15 and 1 Corinthians 5:9 through 10. John 17:15 says, I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. So this is during the high priestly prayer that Christ is giving right before he's taken away to be killed, right before his betrayal. He's in the garden, and he was prepping his disciples for what was to come. It was going to be difficult. There's going to be persecution. The gospel was going to go forth. The world was going to hate them, and they needed encouragement. The Spirit was coming, right? The Spirit was coming to rest on them and to help them and to guide them in all truth. So he was prepping his disciples, and part of that preparation was praying for his disciples. Praying on their behalf, and ours too. He anticipates us, true Christians, in the prayer, verses 20 through 26. And so there are things in this prayer that apply to all believers, even though Jesus does distinguish between his immediate disciples and those who would believe through their word. But the transition language that Jesus uses starting in verse 20 indicate that he's also praying for us. I don't pray for these only, but also for those who will come after them. So anything that he's spoken previously, at least in principle, applies to us as well, to all believers. So when Jesus says in verse 15, I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, that is not something that is just applicable to the disciples in Jesus's immediate vicinity, but it also applies to all Christians. This is the will of God for all Christians. We're not to live isolated from the world. So what Jesus is making clear to the Father is what his will is, that the Father not take his disciples out of the world. Jesus was shutting down any notion that the Christian life means physical separation from the world, and given from their divine nature perspective, given the Son and the Father are the same essence and therefore are the same will, ontologically speaking, they have the same purpose, which is that his Christ's people are not to come out of the world, to remain in this world, living out their changed life by the work of Jesus Christ. And then 1 Corinthians 5:9 through 10 is, I think, even more clear. I wrote to you in my epistle not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Yet I certainly did not mean with the sexually immoral people of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. And this one is quite clear. We are not to come out of the world. Paul goes out of his way to clarify that he was not talking about some kind of asceticism or withdrawal, but that we should be in the world. And in context here, he's dealing with those who are sexually immoral in the church. They had the incident where a man was in an incestuous relationship with his mother, and something that I think Paul even said, something that unbelievers didn't even do. Pagans, as bad as they were and as bad as Corinth was, that was too much of a line for them to cross. And yet Christians were engaged in this, and he's talking about how to deal with people like that who are unrepentant. They are to be put out of the church, and you're not to keep company with those sexually immoral people who claim the name of Christ. But he's very clear. He's very clear to clarify that he does not mean anybody and everybody without exception who's sexually immoral. Only those who claim the name of Christ, who have the name brother and are unrepentant. Those are the ones who you should not be keeping company with. They're to be put out of the church, handed over to Satan, and they're to be left to themselves with the end goal of repentance. But for sexually immoral people of the world, we have to be in the world. So we have to be around those people, right? We have to be around those people. And most of the people out there that we interact with are going to be pagans. They're going to be unbelievers. We can't avoid them, right? We would have to come out of the world to do that. And the rhetorical implication here from Paul is that you're not to come out of the world. You'd have to come out of the world. But I don't mean come out of the world, right? I mean stay away from people who say they're Christians and are sexually immoral. That's what Paul is clarifying here. And the reason for this is because bad company corrupts good morals, right? That's what Paul says in this passage as well, or at least in this in the context. Bad company corrupts good morals. And so Christians who are living in open sin, especially like that, and are allowed to go unchecked in the church, they can have almost like a peer pressure and an influence upon other Christians in a way that unbelievers just don't have on us. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be close friends with unbelievers. We have in Proverbs, it talks about a companion of fools will suffer harm, right? That's a general principle, right? If you're close friends with someone who with a pagan who hates God, and you claim the name of Christ, you're going to have some problems likely, right? Because fool is talking about the one who is not a believer, as opposed to the wise man who really does live out the things of God. But this is someone who does not love God, and so we have to be careful not to be close friends, too close to unbelievers. But we can be with unbelievers. We can be around them. We have to be. We're going to be around them all the time. So there's a sense where we have to keep company with unbelievers, and we have to be in the world. Our domestic duties to our relations require us to do that. And they even mention in the particular Baptist too, they talk about believing servants must perform the duties of servants toward their masters, though unbelieving. So even if your employer, I guess would be the general application, your employer is an unbeliever, well, you still got to keep company with him and do what he says, right? That's your Christian duty. That's, I think, what they're saying here. So we have to come to this understanding that the world is not a place to run from. It's a place that we're called to be in as Christians. We're not to run from it and create our own little communes out in the wildernesses of Tennessee to avoid the world because we're scared of what's going to happen to our kids or whatever the case might be. That's not biblical. That's not biblical. We're to be in the world, in living out the scriptures in the world. And as we do so, we'll be salt and light to the world if we're doing those things that God has called us to do. We're to be in the world, right? But we're not to let the world taint us. But the first step towards not being tainted by the world is not coming out of it. It's believing in Christ and living out what he said to do in his word. So Paul is clearly saying that we shouldn't be isolating ourselves from the world. That is not biblical at all. He's talking about people who claim the name of Christ, yet are living in open sin. They are to be put out of the church. And we should not have anything to do because the influence that they can have upon a church. Bad company corrupts good morals, right? The influence that they can have. upon a person. You have to be really, really careful, right? Really, really careful. So both of these examples from scripture, they show us that it is not God's will for Christians to be isolated. Another thing too, how would the Great Commission get done if we pulled ourselves out of the world? How would we perform those duties? And I mentioned this a little bit earlier with our obedient or our employers. How would we fulfill those duties if we don't first live in the world, right? So we have to be really careful about these things. But the particular Baptists subscribing to this confession saw the Christian life as very practical and simple. Being on fire for God does not mean we live in a cave praying 20 hours a day. That's not being on fire for God. That's doing the devil's work. That's doing the devil's work. Being on fire for God means doing what he says toward our relations. We obey our employers, we provide for our families, we obey the government, etc. To abandon these things is to live contrary to what God has called us to do. We love as Christians to overcomplicate the Christian life. Instead of just doing normal things that all men by nature know to do, we somehow think that being a true Christian is being a pastor, missionary, maybe even doing a podcast, right? We think that, oh, that's the height of spirituality. That's what a true Christian does. They're involved in all these things, right? No, being a true Christian means that we fulfill our duties toward our relations, and we, as God has called us to do, and we walk in a way that is pleasing to him. Nothing more, nothing less. It's that simple. Christian life is simple. It's not a difficult concept. We just make it difficult because we like to add our own rules to it. We like to think that we're more spiritual if we're doing all these other things than what we're actually supposed to be doing. And so we tend to miss the point quite a bit because we're not focused on what God has called us to do. We're focused on what we want to do, right? And, going back to the podcast example, that's something that I even have to guard against doing this podcast. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to do this podcast. I enjoy doing this podcast. It is tiring, but, overall, I enjoy it. But I also have to remember I have a family, I have church duties. This thing can't be all consuming, right? And even right before this podcast started, my wife asked me if I would change my daughter's or put my daughter to bed. And it was 2 minutes before I started. And it's like, oh man, yeah, I wasn't happy about it. But then I remember it's like, well, this is exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. Domestic duties, obligations towards family. This is what I need to be doing, right? And it's something that I have to remind even myself at times. But this is really what the Christian life is about: doing what God has said, living in the world as he has called us to do, and all of that flowing from the finished work of Jesus Christ that we have faith in. That is Christian life. And I see Mike D asks a question here. Do you think outside of doctrinal understanding, a Christian with an introvert personality are more prone to this unbalanced separation from the world? That's a really good question, Mike. Yeah, they might be. They might be more of a tendency. Introverts, I guess, have more of a tendency to be less outspoken, and they don't like. And I think there's jokes that go around about introverts that not wanting to pick up the phone and what it's like to have to call someone as an introvert. But I guess it could. I don't have any data on that. I couldn't say that exactly, but I can see how that would practically work out, Mike, because someone who is of the personality of I don't want to interact with people as much, I like to just be by myself, I may have a harder time. It might be more prone to those things because it fits their personality bubble. So I guess that's something that if someone is prone to that kind of personality, they would have to guard against in terms of how they live in the world. Now, I don't think that being in the world from a biblical perspective means you have to be extroverted and asserting yourself all the time out there. I don't think that means that at all. At the very least, what it means is that we're doing those things that God has called us to do toward our relations in the world, And I think an introvert, someone who's quieter, someone who may not like people as much, can still do that well, as long as they're putting their personality in its proper place, right? They're not letting it rule their lives in a way that causes them to not fulfill those duties that they're called to do, and really idolatrize their, I don't know if that's a word, but idolize is probably the better word, idolize their personality by putting it above what God has asked them to do. But that's a really good question. I hadn't considered that before. I hope that answers your question. All right. I think that's all we got for today. Not a super long episode, but I thought it was interesting. I was looking for a topic this week to talk about out of here, and that came up, and it was like, oh, that's an interesting. It stood out because it was not really in line, I guess, on the surface, in terms of, like, you have all these doctrinal discussions, and then you have this very practical discussion, which kind of stands out. So it kind of stuck out to me, I guess. Thought it'd be good to talk about. All right. Well, with that, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And Lord willing, we will be back next week. Take care.